Well, good morning. Let's start again with a prayer. Try to be here now, which for all of us, for some reason, is the hardest place to be. We always think God will be later, or God was in the past, but it's so hard for us to believe that God is right here, right now. We love you, Lord, in this moment. We thank you that we can live in this moment with you. I ask that whatever I say might somehow be the gospel, your word, and not just my own. We praise you for another day of life. We thank you for the freedom you've offered us in this ever good news. We offer our prayer gratefully in Jesus' name. Today I'd like to present as what I think is certainly a great theme, a primal idea in the Bible, is what I see as the biblical critique of power. And as we see crime only today in a school and in Kosovo, we're so aware that this issue of power has not been addressed. It's only gradually, it seems, that human consciousness can come to the wisdom of what we see only at the end of the Bible, the wisdom of vulnerability. And we can look at the entire development of consciousness in the Bible as a moving in that direction, a movement toward vulnerability. But perhaps of all of the battles that God seems to have with human consciousness, this might be God's most difficult battle. And as we're going to see again, it's a process of mutual mirroring. We're not sure which comes first, the chicken or the egg. Do a violent people create and legitimate a violent God and want a violent God? Or is the presentation of a violent God a legitimation of our own violence? All we know is that both change together. And that when we finally allow God and can receive a nonviolent God, as we have in the risen Christ at the very end of the Bible, we have the legitimation for a nonviolent and non-dominating people. But it takes us a long time to get there. And 2,000 years after the revelation, we still, I think, if we'd be honest, would prefer a punitive, punishing, threatening, and violent God. Quite frankly, because that's the way we want to be. That's the way we want to be. And you become the God you worship. I guess I had to give a title. Maybe I'd call this talk, Almightiness Cannot Be Loved. Almightiness doesn't enter into the love equation. Love is not possible between two almighties. And so we're going to see, as the Bible moves forward, God becoming in our consciousness ever more touchable, shareable, vulnerable, nonviolent, if you will. Although that word did not exist, I'm told, in most major languages until the 1960s, the word nonviolence, to show that it was not even in our consciousness. That's how hard it is to get to this level of being, or this level of awareness. I'd like to read a quote from Marion Woodman in her book, The Ravaged Bridegroom. She says, psychologically, which is her background, and spiritually, however, she says, there is no victory through domination. There is no such thing as triumph by force, psychologically or spiritually, even if that force is elegantly disguised. Domination is domination. The dominated one eventually becomes another dominator, as we know, or we should know, you'd think we'd know by now in history, who is abandoned, a beautiful phrase I think she has here, abandoned outside the civilizing influence of love. And so we see that most generations pass on, as I always say, their garbage to the next generation. What the Word of God is seeking to do is to stop the cycle, to stop the cycle of violence, as we put it now. Where we all begin, and where the Bible certainly begins, because it's where human consciousness begins, is with the idea of dominative power. We all seem to think that problems can be solved by dominative power. And I'm going to define dominative power as changing things from the top down, right, and from the outside in. Now, what the Word of God moves us toward, and we'll finally see it fully in Jesus, and especially in the risen Jesus, we'll see us moving toward relational power, or what we might call spiritual power, where things are not just changed but transformed, and not transformed from the top down but from the bottom up, and not transformed from the outside in but from the inside out. Now, what this speaks is of an amazing patience in God. The more I try to live with God, the more it seems to me God must be very humble and very patient. Because God seems to be willing to wait for transformation, willing to wait for spiritual power. So political power or dominative power, and I guess I'd almost use them the same, is the ability to influence others through coercion, hiring and firing, punishing, threatening, money, position, role. I have the power to change you, I have the power to threaten you, and I'm going to use it. And that does rearrange the furniture. Most of us will respond to that. But as even Napoleon said, all we can do is rearrange the furniture. Only the Spirit can really change the living room, can change the room in which we live. So political or dominative power is achieved by ambition, and for the most part maintained by control. And I think the disappointment of us is, for many of us, is that this can operate even in spiritual circles, even, I'm sad to say, in the church. That we can resort to dominative power because it's more efficient. It's more effective. It gets things done quickly. And we, I guess, don't have the patience and the humility of God. We want it done tomorrow or today or yesterday. Spiritual power, and maybe this is oversimplified, but I don't think so. Spiritual power is the ability to influence others through one's very being, through who you are. Not through your role, not through your ability to threat, by what you've become. By what you've become transforms and changes other people and calls them to keep growing and to keep changing. Through your own kindness. When you meet a truly kind person, something in your deepest psyche wants to say, how'd she get that way? How'd he get so patient, so loving? We only learn patience through patient people. We only become loving by encountering loving people. There's really no other way. That's the way human beings grow. We rub off on one another. By another person's humor, by another person's integrity, by their freedom to still be joyful when you know by what they've suffered in their life, they have every reason to be bitter. And don't you want to go up and shake some people and say, how come you're not bitter? You should be. Who is the God you know? Who has transformed you? What is it you know that I don't know? Rub off on me, you want to say. That's the character of spiritual power. And it seems to me that's where the Word of God is leading us, to that inner transformation. I'm sure you've heard the name Friedrich Nietzsche. He was a brilliant German philosopher of the last century, the one who said God is dead. But, you know, in fairness to him, he might have been the single most brilliant mind of the last century. Nietzsche was not dumb. His analysis of what's happening in history, I don't agree with his conclusions, but his analysis is in fact right on. And one of his primal points by which he criticizes European history is he says, this damnable Judeo-Christianity that you're involved with, it's teaching you to be sheep. And if you remember, he said, we've got to be supermen. If we want European civilization to triumph, we have to be stronger and stronger, and this Jesus character is not teaching you how to be strong. He's teaching you the way of powerlessness, and what we need is the way of power. And of course we know it was Hitler who followed, in many ways, the philosophy and mythology of Nietzsche. Nietzsche understood, actually, I think, better than most Christians exactly what Jesus was doing. That's the irony of it. He understood Jesus better than most clergymen, in my opinion. He was absolutely brilliant. And he knew Jesus was giving an absolute critique to power, was undercutting dominative power at its source and at its foundation. And that's why he said, until Europe gets rid of Christianity, Europe will never become great. He was right. In a worldly sense. He was wrong, of course, utterly wrong, in the sense that matters. And as I said in the first lecture, what I believe the Bible is about is what is happening in history. And our great themes that we're trying to allude to are saying what is not just the obvious thing, which is what we get caught up in each day, the morning paper, but what's the subscript, what's underneath, what's really happening in history. And I think God is creating a people who are non-almighty, all right? Who are vulnerable, who are capable of relational power and spiritual power, who are capable of rubbing off on one another and being influenced by the other. And of course, we will not trust that kind of power until we see a God who operates the same way. Until you meet a God of vulnerability and mercy and tenderness, who can deal with exceptions, who can negotiate and maneuver the situation to make it still transform, then we understand the same. So what the Bible is finally going to say, to give you the end at the beginning, is that the only kind of power you can trust is the power of people who in fact have made journeys into powerlessness. All right, now that's going to become real evident. It's so obvious. It's one of those things hidden in plain sight. It's like almost the only theme of the Bible. You wonder, how did we not see it? It's like fish don't see the water and we don't know that we're surrounded by air. We've read the Bible so much and we don't realize that from the very beginning, the Bible is undercutting power and teaching powerlessness. And it's always, always, always the powerless ones that God is able to use. Who's God's first choice? An enslaved people in Egypt. He didn't pick the Egyptians, all right? He picked the Semites, the Israelites, the people on the bottom. Because remember, the bottom is the privileged position, not the top. And I hope that will become clearer by the time we end today. Then when he finally gets them to trust God and leads them to the Red Sea in Exodus 14, Moses says to the people, "Have no fear, stand firm. You will see what Yahweh will do to save you." So this is very different than heroic mythology, where you have to do it. You have to be Hercules and Prometheus, all right? Do you feel the difference? The Egyptians will see today what God will do for you. You will never see it again, what I'm about to do. Yahweh will do the fighting for you. You have only to keep still. There's the big line. Exodus 14:14, the beginning of the whole contemplative tradition. You have only to keep still. Stop trying. Stop trying to make it happen. Learn the mystery of surrender and trust, which is moving into a new identity that we've been talking about from the beginning, a new experience of the self, a transformed self, what we would call the Christ self or the God self. Buddhists would call it the Buddha self. It's a different experience of the self. It's who you are in God. Now we're going to see as the Bible develops, first we have the choice of Israel, the people on the bottom. Then we'll have consistently the choice of the barren woman, Sarah being the first, who bears Isaac. It's never the fertile woman who does it. The mother of Samson is barren. Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, is barren. And the one I want to read from especially now is Hannah, the mother of the prophet Samuel, is also barren. And as always, they come to God for their fertility, for their identity, for their deeper personhood. We have this beautiful prayer of Hannah in the temple, asking God that she can bear a child. God gives her a son, Samuel. She goes to the temple and dedicates him to the Lord. And then she offers this beautiful prayer. Now you're going to hear some echoes in this prayer. Hannah, it sounds like Anna, right? It's probably why we made Anna the mother of Mary, even though there's no Anna in the Bible. Listen to what Hannah says. The bow of the mighty has been broken, but the feeble have girded themselves with strength. The well-satisfied are hiring themselves out for bread, but the famished cease from all labor. The barren woman bears sevenfold, and the mother of many is desolate. Yahweh makes poor and makes rich. Yahweh humbles and he also exalts. He lifts up the poor from the dung heap and pulls down the mighty from their thrones. Now, where have you heard that? Of course, Luke takes these words from Hannah and puts them beautifully in the mouth of Mary, which is what we call the Magnificat. Because this theme of God using the nobodies, which Mary now personifies, she really is the nobody. She's a little uneducated Jewish girl who simply has learned one thing, how to say yes and how to trust God infinitely. And that was enough. That's all God needed to break into the world. But it's always the theme of the barren woman. Then we have the forgotten son or the rejected son like David. Remember, Jesse shows all of his sons to Samuel. And he says, don't you have another one? Oh, that's right. There's another boy, but he's out in the field. You don't want to bother with him. Samuel says, bring him in. All right? And he anoints him, and he becomes the great David, the archetypal whole man of the Jewish scriptures. It's always the forgotten one. The rejected prophet, Jeremiah. Then Isaiah probably takes this to an art form in what we call the hymns of the suffering servant in Isaiah 49 to 53, where it's clearly the outsider, the rejected one, who understands, who is the gift giver, who is the transformer. In Job, we have the unjust sufferer. But always again and again, it's the powerless one who God can give power to. Now hold on to that. That's crucial, and that has not changed to this day. God cannot risk giving power to anybody except people who know they're powerless. And you don't learn that except through painful journeys. Painful journeys of transformation. By the time we get to the Psalms, we have just Psalm one after another. I mean, if there's any doubt about the inspiration of the Bible, read the Psalms. These are people with some few exceptions. Remember, 3 steps forward, 2 steps backward. There's always both and, but most of the Psalms reveal such a high level of spiritual consciousness. People who've clearly, personally encountered an infinite lover, a safe world made safe by a God who goes after them and protects them and is always on their side. But inside of that, in fact, let me read one or the other, like Psalm 123. Inside of that, we have people who now are free to be small and little and vulnerable because they don't have to protect themselves. Do you understand? When God is not protecting you, you've got to be heroic. You've got to be great and significant and powerful. When you can trust that you're not doing it alone, that all your thoughts are not just your thoughts, that all the work isn't up to you, then you can let go. Why else would you let go? You can't let go until you can trust that someone else is in control. Psalm 123. I lift my eyes to you who have your home in heaven. Eyes like the eyes of slaves on their master's hand, like the eyes of a young girl fixed on the hand of her mistress. So our eyes are fixed on Yahweh our God, for we know you will take pity on us. Pity us, O Lord, have pity on us. We have had more than our share of scorn, more than our share of jeers from the complacent, of scorn from the proud. This is clearly a people who've been on the bottom, and yet they understand. Let's read another short one. Beautiful Psalm 131. Yahweh, my heart has no lofty ambitions. My eyes do not look too high. I am not concerned with great affairs, or marvels beyond my scope. Enough for me to keep my soul tranquil and quiet, like a child in its mother's arms, as content as a child that has been weaned. Israel, rely on this God, now and forever. This is a different kind of people than most of history has created. You can see the Word of God already is effective, already is transforming people. We don't have religion filled with control freaks anymore, all right? Suddenly there are people who can trust, who can see what's really happening. They don't have to control it all because they can trust that someone better, someone wiser, and someone even more loving is in control. Brothers and sisters, you've got to know that's the great freedom. That's the freedom to receive your soul when you don't have to fix everything yourself, when you don't have to explain everything yourself, when you don't have to understand everything yourself, when you don't have to push it around. It worries me how many pushy people we're creating, and yet I think it's inevitable in a secular culture. It's inevitable. Do you see why? Why wouldn't you push it around? Why wouldn't you be a control freak if there's not someone else wiser and better that you can trust? Of course, it's inevitable. The only way community is possible, the only way communion is possible, the only way intimacy and vulnerability is possible is in the presence of a God who is involved with us, who is taking care of us and yet giving us a power that we also can trust. And that's the paradox of power. That in fact, when the Spirit is finally given, let me jump ahead to the first chapter of Acts of the Apostles. The name of the Holy Spirit is in fact power. The Father has decided, it says, that you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you. And then you will be my images, like we said before, to the ends of the earth, not only in Jerusalem, but throughout Judea and Samaria, to the very ends of the earth. We have become witnesses, not just to a verbal message, but much more to the divine image. God is finally succeeding and creating those images we talked about in the very first lecture. God is looking for images of who God is. And so power, brothers and sisters, cannot be bad. And there's been a lot of naivete about that, even in recent years. People thinking all power is bad. The Bible does not say power is bad. It reveals the paradox of power. And in fact, if the Holy Spirit is power, then power has to be good. And we don't have to apologize for power. In fact, a truly spiritual woman, a truly whole man, is a very powerful person. And that's the kind of power we want to raise up. God is not interested in keeping us children, but wants powerful people. But powerful people who can handle power. And you know why they can handle it? Because they don't need it. Right? They don't need it. And until you don't need it, until you don't even want it, those are the only people you can give it to. Until you don't need power, you normally cannot handle power. And you have to have made journeys into powerlessness to find the true name of power, what spiritual power really is, and that it's so much more powerful than political power or domination power, because all those do is rearrange from the outside. When Jesus is led into the holy city on that day we call Palm Sunday, there's a very interesting metaphor and image that maybe, most likely, you've paid no attention to. I really didn't either till it caught my eye very recently. In fact, this last Palm Sunday. It seems that Jesus is almost orchestrating the events because he wants the imagery to be very clear. And he tells, if you remember, his apostles to go into the city, and he tells them to find a tethered colt that no one has yet ridden. He says, tell the man the master has need of it. Now hold that image. A tethered colt which no one has yet ridden. Of course, they're waiting for a domination image, a Messiah who's going to come in and change everything from the outside. He says, I've got to change it from the beginning. I'm not going to come in on a horse. I'm not going to come in triumph, but like Zechariah prophesied, I'm going to come in on a donkey, right? To redefine what power is. And this donkey, this powerless image, is a tethered colt. It's been tied up in all of history. No one's ever wanted to use it. No one's ever ridden this tiny donkey before. But I'm going to ride it into the city to show the world a different way, a new way, the way of powerlessness. Now again, Jesus is building on a tradition. He doesn't come out of nowhere. Remember, and I hope I'm saying this on every tape, he's a quintessential Jew. He's standing on his Jewish tradition, so don't make it either or. So often people who've left the church or left religion say they cannot stand the violent God of the Hebrew Scriptures. It isn't totally fair, because the vulnerable God is already breaking through. In the prophets, in Hosea, really in Deuteronomy, he's already breaking through. She's already breaking through in the Psalms and in the wisdom literature. But many people, they'll read these terrible passages where God is calling for blood and death and killing and the ban, kill everybody in the city, and they say, I don't want to follow this God. And of course, they're absolutely right. But they don't keep reading. They don't stay with the text, and they don't realize that the Bible is a text in travail and is a development of the evolution of human consciousness, of our readiness for God. It's saying much more about us than it is about God. Many have said that God created us in God's image, and we return the compliment. We created God in our image. And that isn't the name in the face of God. So we have little by little already in the Hebrew Scriptures God calling the people to this powerlessness. Let me just give you some quick but very important examples. He's calling them to powerlessness by calling them out into the desert in the beginning. They have all their different, many-faceted gods. And he says, I want you to have no other gods before you. Just trust in one God. You've got to know, for most primitive peoples, that was a step down. All right? That was a step backwards. That was a step into a more vulnerable world where you had a God to protect you on every level and for everything. And he says, put all that trust together and just trust me. And let go of all your other gods of the water and of the seas and of childbirth. One God before you. Utter vulnerability is what he's calling them to. Again and again in Joshua and Judges and Exodus and the books of Kings and Samuel, again and again the kings want to form alliances want to form treaties, as you remember. And always you are to have no alliances, no treaties, no horses, no chariots. Trust only in God. Always calling them to powerlessness. And they can't handle it. No, just one good treaty, maybe with the Assyrians or with somebody else. No, just go into battle trusting that I'm with you. You see how consciousness can only move step by step. They fight God all the way. Remember the story of Gideon? He has to whittle Gideon down till he only takes a few men with him into battle. He wants to take hundreds to make sure that he's powerful. Little by little, God has to teach the people powerlessness, what eventually becomes the concept of trust, surrender, or love. For the most part, with the possible partial exception of David, the Hebrew people are led by non-heroes, by very tragic figures, very, very wounded figures, which gives us some hope, because most of history has been that way, hasn't it? We've gotten very few leaders who really are these great, larger-than-life people that we would like, so they have to trust in God. Consistently, God's chosen instruments, as I said before, are imperfect, handicapped sinners, barren women, forgotten sons. Those are his chosen instruments. The only clear exception to that is Mary. Every other instrument that God uses is a transformed sinner. He wants them not to have kings, but they will not give in on that. And so finally he gives in to them. Okay, since you want a king, I'll give you a king. And he gives them Saul, and then they're sorry they asked for one, you know. 2/3 of the Psalms are this kind of struggle with God. Wanting to trust God, finally able to trust God, but struggling with the ability to do it. Wanting to trust in horses and chariots and power and money and kings, if you will. The Bible calls all riches futile. That's a false sense of power. And perhaps we're going to develop this a bit more in the next lecture, but perhaps the greatest vulnerability that God calls them to is the vulnerability and the powerlessness of not knowing. Which is still hard for us today. It's a whole new definition of religion, because religion had always meant making the future predictable, making the future reliable. And the biblical tradition goes exactly the opposite direction. I'm not going to give you predictability. And yet we see to this day how many people, that's what they want religion for, to know that tomorrow will not be different than today, that God is totally predictable, and I never have to go outside my comfort zone. I can always explain God. But God is always leading them into the desert, into places where they have to meet God personally, where they have to trust God personally, where they don't have answers. As we said earlier, they simply have a relationship. We prefer the performance model of performing and earning worthiness. But what the Bible always does is offers you no achievement by performance, simply power through relationship. So remember, everything is moving toward relational power, finally reaching its fullness in Jesus, where he refuses all dominative power in favor of relational power and spiritual power. Persuasive power, perhaps, the power of shared belief, if you will, but it's never enforcing God's will. It's always waiting for transformation. There's so many passages I could refer to. As you know, he has a real hard time with the 12 apostles themselves. Right after he'll teach them the way of powerlessness, they'll start arguing about who's going to be the greatest. And you've got to know that that's almost meant to be a cartoon. You're supposed to laugh at that point, right? That he just taught them about powerlessness, and they wonder who's going to be the new Archbishop of Philadelphia. I mean, it never changes. Having lived in clergy circles, I can say that. I mean, it's when we don't have the relationship, we are preoccupied with the role, with the power, with the external because we don't very often have the internal. And right after they do this, this is Matthew, the 20th chapter, 24th verse. Well, now, this passage is a comparable one, but I'm glad I get to speak to it too. He has spoken of having to suffer and be rejected. And then the mother, so you can't put all the blame on man, the mother makes the request, can my two boys sit at your right and sit at your left? So women have ambition too. It's not just the clergyman, huh? And you can just see Jesus rolling his eyes. How can you so miss the point, Mrs. Zebedee? You know, this is not what it's about. It's not about roles and being archbishop. But when it says in verse 24, when the other 10 heard this, they were indignant with the two brothers. Now, why were they indignant? Because they wanted to be Archbishop of Chicago. Do you understand? That's all. And Mrs. Zebedee's getting her boys in first, you know. But Jesus called them all together. He's so patient with these guys. He really is. They consistently miss the point. You do know that. Until the very end. Until the very end. Right? It's amazing that we call them the 12 apostles. All right? And even at the resurrection, it's only the women who believe it. The men still don't believe it and still don't get it. And yet, that becomes, now hold on to this, you think I'm putting down the apostles? That becomes their initiating journey of transformation. Because finally they're powerless. Follow me? They've been so damn stupid for so long, so missed the point, that finally they know what it's like to be on the bottom, and from that, they are transformed people who can risk being on the top. Got it? This is crucial. And that's why whenever Jesus describes the passion, he says, the human one, the Son of Man, as he calls it, he's describing himself as every man, the human one. It's the most common word he uses of himself. The human one has to suffer and be rejected. Those are two different experiences. Until you suffer and have been rejected, there's something you don't understand. But anyway, he goes on here, he says, Jesus called them around. He said, you know, among the pagans, the rulers lord it over them, dominative power. And their great men make their authority felt, political power. This is not to happen among you. Don't get angry at me, I'm quoting Jesus, all right? This is not to happen among you. No, anyone who wants to be great among you must be the servant of all. And anyone who wants to be first among you must be the slave of all. Because the human one, myself, came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus has forever undercut the nature of power. He has given us an absolute critique of power that I believe we still are hard-pressed to believe 2,000 years later. You can almost connect the dots, especially from Constantine in 313, when we moved out of the catacombs, the position of vulnerability, where the Spirit was able to work quite well when we were on the bottom. And overnight in 313, we moved from the bottom position to the top. Literally from the catacombs to the basilicas. The very word means the palaces of the kings and the queens. We became the established religion of the empire. And brothers and sisters, if I have to give one date that changes everything in terms of our perspective, our reading of the gospel, we stopped reading it from the bottom and we started reading it from the top, from the position of establishment. Now, by the grace of God, the saints and the martyrs and the prophets and the holy ones in every century still got the point. But only if they were willing to go through those painful descents, what Jesus calls the way of the cross. And without that, there's something you simply don't understand. So in the Christian scriptures, what we call the New Testament, you notice I am referring to this as the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures. Because I know probably the other language will not go away. But old and new gives us the impression that the one totally supersedes the other. And I would like to present this as a constant development. And that the Christian scriptures could never have happened without the Hebrew scriptures, and they build on one another. But in the Christian scriptures, We have, of course, John the Baptist, who is now the new one, who is going to have to go through the great descent, so he'll understand. And Jesus says, you killed my cousin John the Baptist, and you killed the prophets. We would tend to think that you preach a true message, which might be a hard and demanding message, and then you will be rejected. And so, of course, the prophets are always rejected for preaching their hard and true message. But in fact, I invite you to think in a very different way. Here's actually, I believe, the meaning of the rejection of the prophets. That you can't be a prophet. In fact, you have nothing to say until you have been rejected, until you have been persecuted. It's the outsider who reveals what the system is really all about. Please hold on to that, all right? The outsider has the privileged knowing of what the system really stands for. In fact, it's the outsider that only knows, and that's why Jesus becomes the quintessential outsider, the quintessential excluded one, killed outside the walls. Because when you've been rejected, there's something you know about whatever the system is that no one else ever knows. So it's not preach a true message and you will be rejected. It's be rejected and have a true message. And that's why all of the prophets are rejected people. And why Jesus must be rejected, why Job is rejected, why Isaiah is rejected, all of the great ones. You have to be rejected to understand. Now, let's go to the Christian scriptures and see what Jesus does with these first guys who think they know everything. I'm going to use Luke 9. He called the 12 together. He gave them power and authority over all devils and to cure diseases. These guys can't handle that much power. You know, they're going to think they're bigger than everybody and holier than thou. And so, what's the next verse? He says, I'm sending you out 2 by 2. Real vulnerable. Not in the big group anymore. Leave the group. Take nothing for your journey. Neither staff, nor haversack, nor bread, nor money. Let none of you take a spare tunic. Oh God, you can just see him. I don't want to go. You know, who would want to go on such a journey? He's sending them into a situation of certain failure, rejection, vulnerability, where they have to rely upon other people. For centuries, we've struggled with these texts, especially we Franciscans, because Francis took this literally, and none of us could ever live up to it. You know, it's like, well, we got to have buildings, we got to have computers now, we got to have telephones to do this good work. We can't believe what Jesus said here, so like most of the Bible, we just rejected it and ignored it. This is not a program for the whole of life, it's an initiation rite. You follow me? It's an initiation rite. You've got to go through this or there's something you won't understand. You guys are nice middle-class white boys, all right, living in the suburbs of Cincinnati, and there's something you don't know about the nature of reality. And I'm going to send you out into the streets of the inner city without anything so you learn what the system's really about. We used to call them urban plunges, remember? There's no other way you know until you've been rejected from the system. And you've each got to find that place in your own life where you have been considered inferior. I'm not saying this because there's a lot of women in the crowd today, but in fact, this is why historically women have had a spiritual advantage, because in almost all cultures, they're in the one-down position. Men are at the top, and in most cultures, women are in second position. I'm sorry, but it has been that way, and it probably still is. Now, worldly-wise, you can say, oh, this is terrible, it's unjust, it's wrong. Spiritually, it's an advantage. Right? It's an epistemological advantage, a symbolic advantage. And the excluded one always understands what it is that's really holding the system together. You follow me? What it is that people are really believing in. They say they're all believing in God until you're kicked out. I lived my first years in downtown Albuquerque, and just a block from the homeless shelter. And one morning I got up early to go over and pick up a paper at the newsstand, and where the homeless often sat along the street, and one had written in chalk on the sidewalk, and since I was early in the morning it was still there. And this is what was written. I'm not making this up. He said in chalk, "I watch how eagerly these people protect their nothing. Truly, God is hated here." That's what was written on the sidewalk. "I watch how eagerly these people protect their nothing. Truly, God is hated here." Now, I'm sure this was written by an embittered homeless person, but there was some truth in what the person was saying. There's something you can see when you're outside the system that you cannot see inside. And what Jesus has to do is make sure that all of his followers have had that experience somewhere in their life. Somewhere be handicapped, please. Or have a handicapped child, or be a minority, or someone who has been looked down upon, because that's the place of transformation. That's the place you understand. If you've been a racial minority, a sexual minority, a economic minority, but somewhere where you know what it's like not to be liked, not to be loved, not to be received, not to be respected, those understand. And the irony is, brothers and sisters, that most of the gospel has been communicated by people who are very comfortable. Which is almost an absolute assurance that you'll miss the point. That you will not preach the true gospel. That you cannot. It worries me, and I can see what my Father Francis was trying to do by getting us outside the clerical system and making us poor so we'd understand, and didn't want us to be priests. But it worries me when we take people to train them for ministry and immediately give them perk and position and privilege and status. You're almost absolutely assuring they'll have nothing to say. I've got to say that I'm not trying to be rebellious. I'm not trying to be iconoclastic. You're almost assuring they will have nothing to say that is the gospel. They might have nice words about some nice things. Do you understand? As I often have, I'm no different. But the real gospel, the real power of that aggressive fidelity that I talked about yesterday will never come forth until you've experienced the pain. And so Jesus becomes the great rejected one, as I said. He sends his disciples into vulnerable, rejectable states. How else can you understand what we call the 8 Beatitudes? How else can you understand them? Please, answer me. There's no way. And that's why we haven't taken them seriously. The so-called 8 Beatitudes, the opening of his inaugural address, are absolutely assuring that you will experience rejection, failure, and vulnerability. And that's why we don't follow them. We don't pay any attention to them. We read them on All Saints' Day and ignore them. Because no one wants to live being meek and poor in spirit and weeping. Tell a man, thou shalt weep. On my men's initiation rites, I have to take a whole day. This won't surprise you women. We call it Grief Day. And I have to teach men a whole day about the mystery of mourning and of weeping and of grieving. And when they learn it, most men have 25 years of stuffed tears that they've never been in touch with. All the things they want to cry about, going back to their boyhood, that they've never been able to cry about. And all initiation rites have to go through a period of necessary grieving. Probably the best single line in men's work is this: any young man who cannot cry is a savage. You have to teach a boy the tears of things. You have to teach him how to go down into the pain of the world, because his whole intention when he's young is to go up into power and fame and ambition and greatness. A young man who cannot cry is a savage, and an old man who cannot laugh is a fool. That's the best summary of everything I teach on the men's retreats. Because at the end of life, after you've been through the terrifying journeys, after you've seen what's real and what's unreal, there's something laughable about it all. In fact, if you can't laugh, you haven't been transformed. You're taking it all too seriously, and your own failures all too seriously. But when you see that your failures really, don't matter. In fact, they were the great school. I tell the men, success has nothing to teach you after 30. Nothing. You just need a few successes to get started. That's all. And that's why Jesus' wisdom is not the language of ascent, but descent. The fundamental rule, let's put it this way, the fundamental rule of the biblical game, of the divine game, if I can use that metaphor, is he who loses wins. Right? That's the fundamental law. He who loses wins. Because it's in the losing experience that, in fact, you understand everything. And success has almost nothing to teach you. Can you see what trouble we're in this culture? Where everything's about success? And all of our young people are being told that that's where wisdom lies. There is not one spiritual teacher in any of the great world religions that would agree with that. We're on an absolutely deadly, toxic course. No wonder we have kids going into schoolrooms and shooting, as we did yesterday. It's an incoherent world. It makes no sense. It's got all the wrong goals and meanings and definitions of what power truly is. And so we seek lethal power because we do not have that spiritual power that is the true self. So Jesus said, blessed are you when people reject you, when people speak every kind of evil against you. Now you understand that, huh? And how many times have you heard that and said, well, what does he mean by that? And I mean, no one agrees with that. Do you know anybody who agrees with that? Blessed are you when people reject you and speak every kind of evil against you. He says the human one must suffer and be rejected. There's a certain kind of social not being liked that is necessary for us to understand the social fabric itself. Yes. A certain kind of social degradation, because otherwise we put all of our reputation into this social game, this mirroring process of looking good, of being popular, of being famous, of being liked. We spend our whole life looking for our 20 minutes of fame, which is all going to die when we die anyway, and you got nothing. Who you are apart from that, apart from what other people think you are, is who you are. Now that's why we teach contemplative prayer, and why I keep saying that apart from prayer you really don't dare read the scriptures. Because what happens in prayer is those false images of the self fall away. Your reputational self. That's what's going to die when you die, right? Who you think you are and who others think you are is not who you are. That's ephemeral. That's whimsical. It passes. It does not matter. So the outsider reveals what is hidden and denied and avoided and hated and feared. The outsider always carries the truth. And so the Bible is a history of the outsiders. That's what makes the Bible a unique piece of literature. That it's not establishment literature written from the top. It's disestablishment literature written by the outsiders. And it's amazing that it stood the test of time. But most of us have not been able to read it from that context because we were not outsiders ourselves. As I said earlier, this is why sometimes people who are oppressed or enslaved have been the privileged readers of the scriptures. Jesus becomes the ultimate outsider to save the inside. Got it? But the way he has to do that is to invite the so-called insiders outside. Amazing. One time when I was teaching theology in Albuquerque, I did a diagram on the board of the temple, the very architecture of the temple. By the time Jesus has come, the very architecture of the temple reveals geometrically and in concrete and stone what I'm talking about spiritually. You have the Holy of Holies. It's revealing degrees of worthiness, degrees of inside and degrees of outside. The Holy of Holies, which only the high priest can go in one day a year. Then you have around it the court of the priests and the Levites, which only they can go into. Then you have the court of the circumcised Jewish men, which only they can go into. And the outer court of the temple is the court of the Jewish women, which actually, at least during their menstruating years, they could only get into maybe a week out of the year. Right? So now this was replicated in the synagogues. Whenever you've seen biblical movies, remember how the women are always standing outside looking through a grate, and the men are in the center reading the scriptures and dancing or whatever else it might be. And the women accepted this secondary status. But as I said, there were all kind of debt codes and purity codes of worthiness. And every time a woman menstruated, every time she had a baby, she was declared unworthy for a certain amount of weeks or months and was not able to enter into the temple again. Now, I do want to stop at this point and say, do you really think that's from God? That's why we've got to read the Bible. Yes, inspired. I'm not for a minute denying the inspiration of the Bible. But I'm saying it's in the great themes, in the whole development of consciousness. You can prove anything you want from one quote of the Bible. And here's one of those quotes. Do you really think Jesus felt women were impure after menstruation? Who created menstruation? God, all right? He isn't about to come along and say it's bad. In fact, what we find is women are more at home with blood than men are, and men are afraid of blood. The whole life-death mystery, whereas women are initiated into it. So it isn't a disadvantage. It isn't an impurity. In initiation rites, we find out it's in fact an advantage. Anyway, back to the story. We've got the groups inside. If you read Leviticus and Numbers, you'll find there are 7 distinct groups outside the temple. I hope I'll remember at least most of them. First of all, and this probably came from health, contagion concerns, people with all skin diseases, right, were declared permanently unworthy and could not come into the temple. This is normally translated as lepers, and that's why we have so many times Jesus touching lepers, and you all know that the moment he touches them, he is unclean for 3 weeks and can't go in the temple himself, supposedly. He does, but he's declared unworthy. There's people who are handicapped. Talk about blaming the victim. And I'm not judging Judaism. Every religion does this. Every religion declares degrees of worthiness and unworthiness by completely arbitrary standards, and usually cultural standards that have nothing to do with God. But people who had physical handicaps, deformities of their sexual organs or bodily organs, were declared unworthy and couldn't come into the temple. There's the bastard sons of priests. Of course, all Gentiles, which is the biggest group, probably all of us in this room, unless you're Jewish by background, would have been declared hopelessly lost and unworthy. Sort of like we used to do to the Protestants. You know, I mean, this never changes. Just know this, all right? It never changes. And the Protestants, of course, do it to us, or some do today. When the ego is simply looking to maintain itself and to give itself self-image, it will use God to pull itself up. And at that point, we're not following God, we're having God follow us. At any rate, if you want to do some exciting scripture study after you leave here, and so you won't just believing me that I'm doing a trip on you and making all this stuff up, I ask you to go to the 4 Gospels. And I want you to see, just start making 2-column list, which I used to be famous for, always making my 2-column list. But make 2-column list and find out who are the people who fight Jesus every step of the way. I'm not making this up. They're the people inside the temple, all right? Don't hate me. Don't call me a heretic. Go to the text, all right? Who are the people who consistently respond to Jesus, love Jesus, welcome Jesus, and are transformed by Jesus? They're almost always in those 7 groups who were declared unworthy and outside the temple. This is most amazing. And yet, it isn't amazing at all. It's the pattern of all of history. And that's why his opening words of his inaugural address are, "Blessed are the little ones, for they will inherit the kingdom of God." They have this great big advantage, this great big head start over the rest of us. All hidden things are revealed by the outsider. Everything we're afraid of, everything we deny, everything we avoid, everything we don't want to see is revealed not by the insider, but always by the outsider. The person with power keeps trying to fix, keeps trying to change and explain. The person without power must transform. They must transform. They can't just have answers in their head. They have to grow up, let's put it that way. They have to change. They can't just use religion for their own selfish purpose. They have to change when you don't have power. And so the person in the powerless position has that consistent symbolic advantage. The native peoples in New Mexico where I live, they call it coyote energy or trickster energy. That in fact there's a little humor with it. There's a little cleverness with it. There's a little wile and guile with it. And actually what we see developing in the Bible is a God of wile and guile and trickster and cleverness, all used in our favor. And always saying to history, it's not what you think. It's not what you think. What you think is power is really not power, and what people think is not power is really power. That is the genius of the biblical tradition. And don't let anybody tell you that the Bible is validating violence, because it's all moving toward the risen Christ where there's absolutely no violence left in God. Where God is identified with universal forgiveness, where God is forgiving through Jesus everything in sight, and loving and respecting and honoring everything in sight, and calling us into that same image. So let me end by saying that we become the God we worship. And the God we allow is the God that we have become. I don't know which comes first. Do you follow the logic of that? We can finally see the risen Christ in his vulnerability and nonviolence when we have given up our own need for domination, power, threat, and control and punishment. Then we can allow and see what's obvious in the text. I don't think we could see it in most of history because we weren't there ourselves. You can't see the kind of God you don't want to see. We couldn't see a forgiving God because for the most part, we have not been forgiving people. We've been threatening, punishing people. But the wonder, I have such a wonderful life of being able to preach in so many countries and so many cultures. And I see people in every culture who now see it, who are falling in love with this God and who are becoming just like this God that they're falling in love with. Thank you. So let's take a few minutes. If you want to ask any questions, please feel free. Joe.
In light of the discussion yesterday from Christo's question about youth having their development short-circuited by not having the limitations of the law, and then, of course, this morning being faced with the horrible tragedy in Colorado, a group of kids who considered themselves outsiders, shunned, and yet no fortitude to cope with that. Just wondering, how does that fit together?
It's probably a very good first question, because the outsider status, as we well know, does not necessarily transform you. Only inside of a sacred culture of meaning can we see ourselves as still sons of God, daughters of the Lord, and find our significance in the transcendent one. But in a secular culture like we have, in fact, to be the outsider is almost to be doomed to death, to be doomed to self-destruction and self-hatred, because you do have no significance. Do you understand? There's no vertical significance nor horizontal significance. What I'm talking about as the outsider is the one where horizontal significance is taken away, so I deeply find my vertical significance, if I can use those terms. And I have to find it at a deep level because there's no comfort and no consolation at the horizontal level. But that only works for people inside the family of belief, inside of a sacred universe. This is the burden and the scariness of modern secularism, that we're creating outsiders who have no way in except to up the ante of fame. So if you can't have fame, you'll have infamy. I'll be known as the kid who killed 25 kids in a school. That's infamy, but it's still a form of fame. I've got to give myself significance because I basically don't have significance. The other way we up the ante is this whole addictive society. Okay, I don't feel significant. Maybe a bigger house in a fancier part of town will give me significance. Maybe 3 cars will give me significance. Maybe having the best vice president role will give me significance. So the alcoholics say it very well. You need more and more of what doesn't work. You need more and more of what doesn't work. Whenever you're upping the ante and needing more money, more status symbols, more clothes, more drink, more drugs, more whatever, more anything. Whenever you need more, that's a giveaway that you don't have it. You don't have it. Now that's all a secular culture has left. And that's why we're called an addictive society. Because when you're not grounded in the vertical being of who you are in God, which gives you eternal significance, you have to find your significance in the revolving hall of mirrors, as I called it the day before. That's all our people have left, is the revolving hall of mirrors. And it reaches its nadir, its low point, that I'm never going to be famous for anything positive, so I will be famous and get my face on the front page of the paper for doing something negative. It's frightening. It's frightening. Because I see that only increasing. Only increasing. As one little way to get my 20 minutes of significance. By human beings. Remember I said, biblically, to not encounter who you are in God is to be unbegotten. To be unbegotten, to be unborn. The fragile self that we're dealing with is going to more and more seek negative and violent ways to define the self. That's the history of this century, and I hope it isn't the history of the whole next century, but it very likely could be.
Richard, in the history of the world's religions, worldly power is rejected by way of the journey into the wilderness or by intense episodes of pilgrimage.
Excellent. That's
Okay,
right.
so in particular, the critique is of the village and later of the city. And so, the figure goes out into the wilderness, as you've so often said, in a mode of subtraction.
Yes.
And enters into statuslessness and homelessness.
Yes.
And
Perfect.
that gets incorporated into a lot of the initiation rituals of world religions. So I have 2 questions based on that.
Good.
One is,
You understand it very well. I liked everything you said. Thank you. Yeah.
we live in cities, and we are, most of us, householders. And we're not homeless. We're not mendicants. And we experience God's presence powerfully within our domestic and personal experiences, hopefully.
Hopefully,
We
yes.
hope that we do.
Yeah.
We're all in these big civilizations, we can't all go out into
No.
the desert.
No.
And how can families in cities be in a dialogical exchange with this tradition which, the New Testament is largely formed by these wandering charismatics, and we're not.
Yeah.
That's my first question.
Sure.
The second is related. How, based on what you said about entering into powerlessness, how shall we initiate Christians? And what kind of ongoing adult formation is needed?
Wow. That's wonderful, Lou. Thank you. Okay, for most of us, we have to go, and that's why I've used this word more commonly in previous years, we have to go to the place of our woundedness. Maybe we're not formally rejected from the system, unless we're of a minority race or a gender minority. As I said, women do have a little advantage here over men. We white men are the last in the line, because we've had all the symbolic disadvantages of understanding the truth. Isn't that amazing? But for all of us in this bourgeois, middle-class, comfortable American culture, which I know is what you're rightly describing, we have to go to the place where our marriage didn't work, to the place where we were laughed at because we had glasses in grade school. Yeah. We have to go to the place where we weren't the prettiest girl in high school. Or there's always a place where each of us has mourned, has felt being rejected. And that's the place where we have to start moving forward from. So many women, as you know, it's not just their status as women, which has made them feel excluded sometimes, but because this body thing we've put on women, I found an awful lot of women, and I want to say it to help women, their body, their weight, because we've told them they should all look like Twiggy. I don't think she's even around anymore, but when it's clear, we look at the picture of Our Lady of Guadalupe, God didn't intend women to be that shape, you know. But I feel like 2/3 of the women I have worked with or met have this terrible sense of inferiority because of the very shape of their body that they walk around with every day. But maybe that's the place where they will learn to weep, do you understand? And understand what it's like to not be respected, to not be loved, to not be included, to not be favored, to not be admired by all the guys, you know. Go to that place and weep. You've got to go to some place, and I know every one of you in this room has some place where you can go and weep. So thank you for forcing me to broaden that definition, and there we are outsiders, we really are, but maybe a lot of people wouldn't have thought of it that way. There's always a place in every one of you where you've been an outsider. Go to that place and meet God, is what I'm saying. Now, what do we do about Christian formation or church formation? It's making nice people into nicer people. And and that's not what Jesus came to earth for. It's clear he didn't come to earth into making nice people to feel good about themselves, to give us a sense of moral superiority or one-upmanship or womanship over others. I would say, after being a priest now 29 years, it seems to me an awfully high percentage of established religion is about creating a positive self-image and has very little to do with the search for God. And I hope that's an overstatement. I hope I'm wrong. But it fits my experience. As I meet with so many people, there's never been any real journeying, any real encounter, any real surrender. It's going through this morality game and this ritual, cultish game, thinking that I'm bending the arm of God to get this God to like me and to give me a positive self-image. So I can feel good about myself. The irony is, true religion leads you initially, as I've been saying all day today, into an encounter with a negative self-image. Do you follow me? You know, Scott Peck said the same thing, if I can quote an American psychologist. He quotes at the beginning of that book, of all people, the little flower, St. Therese. And you wouldn't expect an American secular psychologist to quote the little flower. But he said that the same thing was true in his work in psychology, that most people seem to want to simply think well of themselves. And what Teresa says is that whoever is willing to not think well of himself or herself, that person is a pleasant place of shelter for Jesus. Whoever is willing to bear the trial of being displeasing to herself, that's the exact phrase from Teresa. Whoever is willing to bear the trial of being displeasing to herself, that person will be a pleasant place of shelter for Jesus. And Scott Peck goes on to rightly say, I meet hardly anybody who is willing to serenely bear the trial of being displeasing to herself or himself. I will think well of myself. He's saying the exact same thing I'm saying here. And I believe religion will not be preaching the cross, the mystery, the transformative mystery of the cross. And I'm going to be talking about that more in the upcoming days. Until we have a model of mystagogia and catechesis which leads people into that true initiation of the painful, terrifying mystery of the cross. And not just a socialization process of how can I feel good belonging to St. Barbara's parish, which is wonderful. I'm all for it, But that's a third level concern. The big level concern is the entrance into the mysterion, as I called it yesterday. The genius of early church catechesis, and we've discovered a lot of it in the RCIA program. I have great praise for the RCIA when it's done well, is that information was not given to early Christians except insofar as it was matched by sacramental experience. Right? In other words, inner, real encounters with the holy. And then we'll tell you the words. What we've been doing for generations in the West is giving people catechism answers and words way beyond their level of inner experience of God, which trivializes the entire thing, right? And makes people think they have it when they don't have it. They've taken no journeys with God, but they have all the answers. Mystagogia, which was the early name for the initiation right into the mysterion, into the mystery of the cross and resurrection experience, said that words could not surpass experience and that they had to go forward in parallel fashion. Remember how people even had to leave the Mass? Weren't you told that? They couldn't hear the creed. They couldn't receive communion. We call it the Mass of the catechumens. They had to leave because they were not prepared to understand that part until they somehow had experienced communion and had experienced what it meant to say, I believe in one God. Now, of course, we recite the creed and it comes quickly off our tongue as if we know what we're talking about. And then, unfortunately, presuming we do know what we're talking about. The Jewish people were much smarter, said, don't even dare to use the word. Don't even dare to use the word God because you don't know what you're talking about, right? So our whole tradition begins with that, and in fact that's where I'm going to start tomorrow, with that necessary non-knowing as the basis for all knowing. It's a very brief answer to a brilliant question, but it's a starter. Maybe one more, please.
There's some degree of Christian persecution. It's more and more unpolitically correct to be Christian.
That's right.
And yet, in terms of what you're saying, this may be a blessed time. And in time, we may look back and see that this was the beginning of the emergence of a realer Christianity, a truer living out of Christianity, a purifying.
Yes. Just the kind of questions you're all asking just give me so much hope that we're clearly creating an adult, mature Christianity. I didn't get these kind of questions 28 years ago. We weren't there yet. It was all, how far can I go and what's a mortal sin? And, so thank you for saying what you're saying, and I agree with you 100%. I think the Spirit works best underground. The Spirit works best in the minority position, when you don't have an establishment consciousness. And as I'm going to try to say in the upcoming days, I believe the whole mystery of the church is a mystery of a vocation. It doesn't mean we're the ones going to heaven and other people aren't going to heaven. I think God loves all of God's people and God is calling everybody to God's self. But some of us have been given a vocation to be this image in space and time of the freedom and the love and the ecstasy of God. And you're absolutely right that that's really quite fine if that's a small number. I'd rather have a small number that are fitting images than a big number that are playing the religion game, which almost contradicts the message. We see God preparing us for this. That'd be another great theme if I had time for it. In the whole theme of the minyan, which is the Jewish word, or the remnant, or the 10 just men, remember? That God is always whittling the numbers down. I don't know if you know that, but he's always saying, bring, or like he did with Gideon too. I need less. I can do it with 10. That's fine. I think that's going to be true in history. Karl Rahner says that also, that the church very likely will move into a minority position when the real character of the cross becomes clear. Very few people are going to opt for that vocation, right? To be that image when the price is that high. And the price is the language of dissent or subtraction, as you called it before. No one wants to go in the way of the cross, which is our word for the same. But that, as you rightly put it, is a great advantage. I think in that we will see the purification of the message and the gospel. And it can't come too soon. And we're not saying by that we don't love all the people. Because God, as I say, God's Spirit is so obviously working everywhere. I can go into the most secular kind of groups, and I find levels of spiritual insight that I wish we had. Do you understand? God's working everywhere, freeing up everybody, calling everybody to God's self. But he needs some images who are images of Jesus to keep giving us that word of the passion, death, and resurrection, which is the final word that will keep us from self-destruction. And he says he only needs a small remnant to do that. Otherwise, history is on a path toward self-destruction. Doesn't that sound terrible? But it's rather obvious. It's rather obvious. With 6 billion of us on this limited planet. I mean, if all the Chinese want as many cars as the Americans, it's the end of the planet. All right? I'll tell you right now, it's the end of the planet. It's over. There's no way we can sustain this game that we've started in this country. So I just want to give that as why I'm saying we're headed towards destruction. Unless there's people who are willing to live a simple, non-violent life in this world, we will destroy one another as we scramble for the remaining resources on this limited planet and in this limited world. Thank you all. It's been good to be with you. Thank you.